Hi, this is Jason Tondro, Dr. Comics, and I'm speaking to you here from the beautiful campus of UC Riverside. It's the 1st of April, and I just walked out of my class on superhero comics, specifically the superhero narrative. It's English 140J, and I thought that I would give some thoughts about superhero comics and record them and put them up online, and we'll see if anyone gets any sort of response. Today we were mostly talking about Superman, and our excuse here was to Superman's origin specifically. My argument is, if we divide the superhero's basic story into 5 parts, which don't necessarily all come in the same order, but those parts would be his origin, his nemesis, he acquires an enemy or enemies. 3 might be love, he either integrates with his love or he rejects that love. 4 we might call friendship, perhaps a partner or a team situation. And finally, the superhero's quote-unquote death, and I say quote-unquote because superhero almost never actually dies, right? Or if he does die, then he always comes back. And I don't want anybody to think that these basic 5 steps are a straightforward narrative that is happens one and then the next and the next and the next until it ends, but rather that these are sort of components, they're sort of tools that get thrown together in and out and can happen in almost any order, and they may not all be present. It's a thesis, it's a theory put forward. Well, so where does Superman get us? So let's start with his origin. And we spent a little bit of time in class today talking about that origin. We've used some examples. We read Action Comics #1, for example. We read Superman #1, which is a slightly longer version of the same origin, and how it's a little different, right? And we watched Richard Donner's 1978 Superman. A wonderful film, I think, which still holds up surprisingly well. I mean, aside from the moments where you see somebody in like a wide collar shirt or a 70s haircut, right? But other than that, the film holds up pretty well. And there's been a half a dozen other retellings of Superman's origin over the years. You know, something like, well, maybe we start with John Byrne's Man of Steel, for example. We go all the way up through Straczynski's latest Earth 1 project. All right, so we're back. So we're talking about Superman's origin and the different forms that origin has taken. And I think it's very easy for us to get caught up in the minutiae of Superman's origin, but rather instead, let's try and look at the narrative and ask us, can we learn something here? Can we learn about what's going on? So the first thing that we noticed as we were looking at Superman is the kind of anxiety that we saw on the part of the writers, that they weren't terribly sure what they had, and they weren't really sure what they were making, and if it would be popular. So, for example, you see an attempt to explain Superman's powers through some kind of realistic biological metaphor, right? That, oh, well, does it seem impossible that a man could jump over a building? Well, insects can jump proportionally as far, and if a grasshopper was as big as a person, it would jump city blocks. Of course, this ignores simple physics like the cube square law and so on. But what I think is more interesting here, what's more important to us, is that it's revealing on the part of the writers a sort of anxiety about what they were making, that they felt they had to defend it, so that it wasn't fantasy. Those arguments, oh, well, if a bug was as big as a person, it could do feats just like Superman. Those arguments are really saying, this is no fantasy, right? And I'm quoting now from Marlon Brando in the beginning of Superman, the movie. This is no fantasy, no product of a fevered imagination, right? This is reality, or at least plausible. Contrast this with All-Star Superman, right? Where Morrison has no interest in making Superman plausible. That is not the point. The point is to make him as absolutely as impossible, as amazing as he can possibly make him. We're going to push, and so we're going to push that imagination, that creativity, until the boundaries are completely shattered. No one tries to explain that Grant Morrison's Superman, All-Star Superman, is realistic, at least in terms of his physical abilities, because the realism is somewhere else, right? The realism is somewhere else. Okay, so this leads us to Jack Kirby, for example, in Jack Kirby's New Gods. And I'm thinking specifically of Orion. Jack Kirby understood that the physical battles between Orion and the various menaces that he faced were ultimately not the central conflict of the story. It doesn't matter how impossible the character is. And this is why Kirby was so imaginative, right? He's not going to try to explain why these powers are working. He's going to invent some fantastic explanation. Instead, the real crux of this is about what happens when Orion, what does he have to do to win? What does he have to sacrifice to win? There's this wonderful scene in New Gods, for example, where Highfather is trying to speak to Orion. He's like, look, are you going to accept the hand of friendship or the knife? And this is the way that the conflict is posed to Orion. The hand of friendship or the knife? The hand or the knife? Are you going to accept who you are, who you were born to be? Heir to Darkseid, the son of essentially the Antichrist. Or are you going to change? Are you going to accept nurture over nature and be someone different? In my class just an hour ago, we were talking about these characters who were born different. We called them characters who are born great, right? And we're quoting Twelfth Night here. We're quoting Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. And I argue that that's Superman, Batman, and Spider-Man, right? And I suggested that these stories in which someone is born great, that sometimes they're about, that a character can't not be what he is born to be. But I guess now that I think about it, thinking about it in hindsight, that's not really true, right? This is in fact a kind of story. Are you going to struggle against what you were born as and make yourself into something different than the identity you were born with? Now there's a lot of characters that are born great, and Superman is one of them, and the X-Men are another example, and Wonder Woman, and so on. But those characters don't try to not be what they are born as. Superman doesn't say, I'm not going to be Superman. The X-Men, with very few exceptions, don't say, I'm not going to be a mutant anymore. A few of them do. A few of them choose not to be a mutant, and I think we understand that they made the wrong choice. They did the wrong thing by trying to deny what they are. But for characters like Orion, what they are is flawed, right? Is evil. And they want to be better. And it becomes a metaphor for all of us who have a desire to rise above what we're born as. We want to be more than that. We want to be something better than what we are now. We want to be a better man, right? And Kirby understood that where there does have to be realism. Realism is important, but it's not physical realism, it's psychological realism. It's some kind of basic humanity. Yes, you are incredibly physically powerful, and you fly around the skies on some sort of cosmic sled, and you have incredible strength and powers, and Orion is a god, a new god. But inside, here, that's where the realism is. That's where the conflict is. And Kirby understood that, and that's when the superhero story becomes, it transcends the limitations of its own genre. When Ben Jonson was writing Masks in the 1600s, the Mask seems like an incredibly limited genre. It's basically a massive sort of party parade performance. It happens once on a particular day. It's only performed once. It's incredibly costly. It's performed to very specific genre restrictions. Okay, first you're going to have an anti-mask that's dancing, and then you'll have the actual mask itself, and all the lines will be poetry, and they'll be very stilted and very artificial, and everything's very fake and forced. And there'll be elaborate costumes and elaborate stage decorations, and everything will be saturated with allegory and metaphor. So you'll have characters that represent the various seasons, or characters that represent planets, or that represent days of the year, or whatever. Or virtues, characters who represent virtues. And everything is extremely mannered in that sort of artificial way. But Johnson took this genre, this form, which presumably was incredibly limiting, and he transcended that form, and he made it into drama. And you can read Stephen Greenblatt's defense of this in his wonderful book on Johnson. And this is what Kirby did with the superhero. He took it beyond guys in funny costumes fighting each other in the streets. So that there still was that, and I don't mean to imply that there weren't. There's still plenty of fighting going on, plenty of guys in funny costumes fighting each other on the streets in Kirby's comics. But the drama isn't there. The drama is in these moments when the character is forced to make difficult decisions in a very psychologically realistic way. And we see that in All-Star Superman, when Superman is forced to confront his imminent and inescapable death. Right? So we started off by talking about these early Superman comics, and how we saw a kind of defensiveness going on there, where the writers were worried that people wouldn't buy the fantasy. And so we had to come up with explanations. And I think that what this illustrates is this central problem that we see in so many comics of a tension between fantasy, the imaginative, and the realistic. And we see it in plenty of other characters too, right? And I'm thinking of the Hulk. So, in the television series, the Hulk can be just a big, strong guy who can lift a car. But he's not bulletproof, and he can't jump miles, or it's all much, much more toned down, and it's all granted this kind of gravitas by Bill Bixby's so human portrayal of David Banner as a guy with a curse. But in the comic, he can be the Hulk, right? The Incredible Hulk, who's the strongest thing that ever walked the earth.